You were told this verse brings peace. You repeated it when life broke you. You whispered it when everything went silent. And for a moment, it felt like comfort, like safety, like God was telling you to stand still and do nothing, because He would take care of it. But what if that wasn't what He meant? What if that verse, the very one you built your silence on, was never supposed to become your hiding place? What if it became your trap? How many believers have memorized, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still," and used it as a justification to stay silent, passive, paralyzed in the middle of a spiritual war? You prayed it with sincerity. You believed it with trembling hope. But no one told you that right after this verse. In the very next breath, God said the exact opposite. He said, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to move forward," and you didn't move, because you were never shown the full picture. The verse is Exodus 14:14, and it's beautiful. It sounds like relief. It sounds like a blanket over your tired heart. But the verse was never meant to be pulled out of its battlefield and turned into a motivational quote. It was spoken at the Red Sea, with death on one side and fear on the other. The Israelites had just escaped Egypt. They were tired, confused. Behind them, Pharaoh's army was closing in like thunder. Ahead of them, the sea blocked their path. They were trapped. And God said, "Be still." But that stillness was not forever. It wasn't comfort. It was a breath before the storm broke open. And then He said, "Now march." When you isolate this verse from its context, you're not standing on faith. You're standing on half-truth. And Satan loves half-truths. He used one on Eve. He used them on Jesus in the wilderness. And now He uses them on you. A piece of a verse, a fragment of Scripture, just enough to sound holy, but empty enough to keep you still while your purpose drowned. And the churches you trusted to tell you the truth? Many of them teach this verse as an escape from responsibility, not a moment of divine preparation. Let's be honest, some of us aren't being still because we're waiting on God. We're being still because we're afraid. Because moving forward requires confrontation, risk, exposure, obedience. So we choose stillness not as trust, but as avoidance. We use the verse to justify spiritual laziness. We wait for God to fight battles He already told us to face. We pray for Him to move mountains while we refuse to climb. We quote the verse, frame it, sing it, while the Red Sea of our destiny remains untouched, unchallenged, unparted. How many prayers have we wrapped around this verse without realizing it was never meant to be a formula for comfort? It was a word for a moment, a pause in divine timing, a spiritual inhale before the command to exhale faith through action. But we built doctrines on a single breath. We ignored the shout that came after. God never called you to be still forever. He didn't save you from Egypt just to stand by the shore and wait for a miracle you're too afraid to step into. When God said, "Be still," it was to quiet the panic, not to cancel the plan. He was aligning their heart before igniting their feet. The next instruction was clear: move forward. But we never memorized that part. We never turned that into a song. Because the church prefers verses that don't demand obedience. It prefers promises over preparation, peace over process. The danger isn't in the verse itself. It's in the silence that follows when it's taken out of context. It becomes a spiritual lullaby, putting us to sleep when we should be sharpening our swords. It seduces us into waiting when God is calling us to war. Not a war of violence, but of faith. Not a war of blood, but of boldness. And when you don't hear the second part, the part that tells you to move, you begin to think your spiritual paralysis is holy. You begin to call your fear trust. You baptize your avoidance. You sanctify your stagnation. There's a reason you feel stuck. There's a reason you pray and see no change. It's because you're obeying half of a verse and expecting the full blessing. You're standing still in a place where God has already moved on. He's already called you forward, already opened the sea. But you're still on the sand, clutching a verse that was never meant to be your prison. God's promises are never meant to paralyze. If they don't lead you to movement, obedience, or deeper surrender, then someone has twisted them. Maybe the preacher who meant well, maybe the teacher who never studied the full chapter, or maybe you, when you decided that being still was safer than marching into uncertainty. But God never calls His children to safety. He calls them to trust. And trust, by its very nature, demands risk. When He said, "Be still," it was to remind them that the fight was His. But when He said, "Go forward," it was to remind them that faith has feet. Real faith moves. Real faith steps into waters before they part. Real faith doesn't cling to verses. It follows the voice that speaks them. Now, the question is not, are you being still? The real question is, did you stop listening after the part you liked? Because if you did, you're not living in peace. You're living in a pause that was supposed to end. You've turned a sacred moment into a permanent dwelling. And every time you quote that verse, the enemy smiles, because he knows you've silenced your own march. You can't claim deliverance and reject movement. You can't hold on to a promise and refuse the instruction that comes with it. You can't build your spiritual life on half a sentence and expect God to honor what you ignored. Peace is not the absence of motion. Peace is the presence of direction, even when the way forward looks impossible. The Red Sea didn't part while they were standing still. It parted when they moved, when Moses lifted the staff, when the first step hit the water, when obedience overpowered fear. The miracle wasn't in the waiting, it was in the walking, and that miracle is still waiting for you. You thought the silence meant you were forgotten. You looked around and saw others being used, elevated, celebrated, while you remained hidden. You prayed with sincerity, but the heavens felt quiet. You served without recognition. You obeyed without reward. And deep down, you started wondering if something was wrong with you. If maybe, just maybe, God had passed you over. But what if I told you that your hiddenness was not punishment? What if it was preparation? The silence you hate may be the sanctuary where God is forging something hell can't touch. The wilderness isn't a delay. It's the birthplace of the unshakable. Because before God reveals you publicly, He tests you privately. And the ones He uses most powerfully are often the ones He hides the longest. You see, the Bible isn't filled with people who got instant promotions. It's filled with people who were broken in secret, trained in silence, and tested in obscurity. David was anointed king, then sent back to the sheep. No crown, no throne, just isolation and wild animals. But in those fields, away from applause, he learned to worship. He learned to fight. He learned to hear God's voice when no one else was listening. And when the day came to face Goliath, the battlefield didn't make him. The fields did. Joseph had dreams as a teenager, but before the palace came the pit. Before honor came humiliation, betrayed by family, sold as a slave, falsely accused, forgotten in prison. Yet in that prison, God was preparing his mind to lead nations. The strategy, the discernment, the emotional resilience, it didn't come from a throne. It came from the dungeon. And when the doors opened, Joseph wasn't surprised. He was ready. Don't mistake silence for absence. God's not punishing you. He's positioning you. He's developing muscles in the dark that you'll need in the light. You're learning how to hear Him without confirmation, how to trust Him without applause, how to keep walking when no one is watching. And that's exactly what will make you unstoppable. Because those who need recognition to obey will collapse when the recognition disappears. But those who were trained in silence, they move whether or not anyone claps. This is why many fall when they're promoted too fast. They confuse visibility with maturity. They crave stage but lack spine. They want authority without accountability. But God doesn't just build platforms, He builds people. And people of God are not built in spotlights. They are built in caves, deserts, pits, prisons, and lonely places where only His voice remains. Think about Moses, raised in Pharaoh's palace, trained in the finest systems of Egypt. But before he could lead a nation, He had to be broken in the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years of silence, of obscurity, of nothing. And then one day, a burning bush. But that moment wasn't random. It was scheduled. The silence had an expiration date. The obscurity had a divine purpose. The same God who hid you is the one who will lift you, but only after what needs to die in you has died. Only after the desire for applause has burned off. Only after obedience becomes your oxygen, not validation. Because if He elevates you before He finishes you, the platform will expose what the desert was supposed to fix. And God loves you too much to let that happen. This is why your season feels like a contradiction. You feel called, but confined. You feel chosen, but chained. And the enemy uses that contradiction to whisper lies. You missed it? God changed His mind. You're not enough, but you didn't miss it. You're in it. You're in the place where warriors are made, where giants are born, where fire refines what talent can't carry. You weren't left behind. You were placed, hidden by God, like an arrow in a quiver, stretched, pulled back, held still, before being launched into a target no one else could hit. That silence you hate is the stretch before the send, the pullback before the release. And don't be fooled by others' progress. Some were promoted because of charisma, not character. But what they built quickly will collapse under pressure. You, on the other hand, are being built to last. You're not being trained for applause. You're being trained for impact. And that takes time. That takes silence. That takes solitude. Look at Jesus. The Son of God spent 30 years in anonymity for 3 years of ministry. 30 years of silence. No miracles, no sermons, just preparation. But when He stepped into His calling, hell trembled. And when you finally step into yours, it won't be because you forced the timing. It'll be because you passed the test of the quiet. So don't despise the hidden place. That's where you get clean. That's where your motives are stripped. That's where the idol of people's opinions dies. You can't carry divine authority and human approval at the same time. One will break you. The other will build you. You think God is being slow, but He's being thorough. He's answering prayers you forgot you prayed. You asked Him to use you, to make you unshakable, to never let you fall. This is the answer. He's building the foundation so deep that when the storm comes, not if, but when, your house will still be standing. There's no shortcut to being unstoppable, no fast track to spiritual weight. You have to be empty to be filled, crushed to carry oil, hidden to be trusted. That silence is not a sentence. It's a sign that God is still working, still molding, still preparing the table before your enemies. And when He's done, they'll see what the silence was building all along. There's something that happens to a person when God doesn't answer right away, when prayers seem to echo back without reply. It does something deep, almost surgical, inside the soul. At first, you fight it. You fast more. You pray louder. You try to earn a response. But when nothing shifts, you start to question everything. Your calling, your worth, your place in the kingdom. And that's where the real work begins. Because God's silence isn't always about your sin. Sometimes it's about your strength. Sometimes it's about severing your dependence on feelings, on results, on the applause of people. It's where He teaches you to walk by faith, not sight. It's where He purifies your motives, not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it. Because it's possible to preach for Him and still crave the praise of men. It's possible to serve in church and still worship the stage. And until those things die in secret, God will keep you there, not to punish you, but to protect you from what would destroy you later. This is what the wilderness does. It doesn't just strip you of comfort. It exposes your cravings. It reveals what you reach for when heaven is quiet. Do you numb yourself with distractions? Do you run to entertainment? Do you compare yourself with others who seem to be moving faster? The wilderness is where God removes the noise, not to torture you, but to tune you. You can't hear the still, small voice when your mind is full of static. The volume of your surroundings has to go down so the whisper of His will can go up. And if you've ever been in that place, you know it doesn't just challenge your faith. It tests your identity. It breaks every false label the world put on you. Because when you're no longer the talented one, or the promising one, or the anointed one, and you're just a person in the dark with nothing but a word from God, that's when your identity stops being borrowed and starts being birthed. Elijah understood this. After his greatest public victory, he ran into the wilderness and asked God to take his life. He was burnt out, broken, afraid, but God didn't respond with fire or thunder. He whispered. And in that whisper, Elijah rediscovered who he was. Not the performer, not the miracle worker, just a man held together by grace. And that was enough. That's the point of the hidden season. It's not to make you do more. It's to teach you to be more, to be still, to be rooted, to be unshakable. Because when your calling becomes louder than your character, God has to intervene, not to embarrass you, but to rebuild you. And maybe that's where you are. Watching others move ahead while you feel stuck in slow motion, feeling invisible while others are invited, honored, applauded. But let me tell you, what God is building in silence, He will reveal in power. The delay you hate may be the very thing that keeps you from destruction. Because premature exposure is a spiritual threat. What you build outside of God's timing, you'll have to sustain outside of His grace. That's why Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness before stepping into His public ministry. Not for show, but for strength. He had to defeat temptation in private before confronting it in public. He had to face the voice of the enemy alone before challenging it in the synagogue. And when Satan came, offering shortcuts and recognition, Jesus didn't flinch. Because identity that has been forged in silence doesn't depend on applause. It stands even when the crowd vanishes. You're being trained the same way, not for comfort, but for combat. Because spiritual warfare doesn't care about titles. Demons don't respond to popularity. Hell only trembles when it sees someone who's been tested in fire and didn't break. And that's what God is forming in you right now. Some of the most dangerous people in the kingdom are the ones you've never heard of. They're not on stages, they're not on posters, but in secret. They pray until strongholds fall. They worship when no one watches. They carry authority not because they shout, but because they've been silent with God long enough to hear what others ignore. That's the power of hiddenness. It's not a curse, it's a consecration. And it's why the devil fights your silence so hard. Because he knows what's being formed in it. He knows that a believer who doesn't need the spotlight is a threat to his system. That someone who's content to be faithful in secret will be dangerous when they're released. So he whispers lies to make you leave too early. He tells you you're behind, that you missed it, that you're not chosen. But the devil is terrified of what's being birthed in you while no one is clapping. Because when you emerge, you won't just speak. You'll carry weight. You won't just preach, you'll deliver. You won't just sing, you'll shift atmospheres. And that kind of power isn't taught. It's forged. In the dark, in the silence, in the tears you cried when no one saw, in the prayers you prayed when no one cared. So hold on. Keep digging wells in the desert. Keep waking up and showing up even when it feels like nothing's changing. Keep serving with no spotlight. Keep praying with no applause, because you are not being buried. You are being planted. And at the right time, the seed breaks through. Not because it forced its way out, but because the roots were finally deep enough to hold what God was about to grow. There's a reason God doesn't announce what He's building in you. Heaven doesn't need to advertise what hell already fears. You keep asking why no one sees you, why your gifts are overlooked, why your name isn't being called. But what if the delay is not about being ignored, but about being protected? See, God doesn't raise up the unstoppable in public arenas. He does it in hidden caves. That's why David wasn't crowned in a castle. He was found in a field, behind sheep. That's why Moses wasn't prepared in a palace. He was broken in the desert. That's why Joseph didn't walk straight from his dream to the throne. He walked through betrayal, slavery, prison, and silence. And every step that looked like rejection was actually preparation. Because when God calls you to be a threat, He doesn't give you a platform first, He gives you pressure. And the silence you're in right now isn't empty, it's sacred. It's where He's laying the foundation for authority that can't be shaken by applause or destroyed by criticism. Because when you're finally sent, you won't be a performer, you'll be a weapon. Most people think authority is given in stages, but it's actually forged in the silence of surrender. The kind of surrender that happens when everything you thought would open stays shut. When every prayer feels unanswered. When your strength is gone and you still choose to believe. That kind of surrender terrifies darkness, because now you're not obeying God for the outcome. You're obeying because He is worthy. Even if you never get what you wanted, that's when you shift. From a believer who follows Jesus for blessings to a warrior who follows Him into battle. You no longer need validation to obey. You don't panic when you're misunderstood. You don't flinch when you're forgotten, because something deeper has been rooted in you. Not hype, not excitement, but holy resolve. That's why the devil hates believers who are invisible but obedient. Because they can't be bribed. They can't be manipulated by fame. They don't post to be praised. They pray when the room is empty. They fast when there's no spotlight. They forgive people who never apologized. Because they understand something most of the church forgot. It's not about being seen, it's about being sealed. And God seals His vessels in private. Just like He hid Paul for years in Arabia before releasing him to the Gentiles. Just like He silenced Zechariah before he could speak about John the Baptist. Just like He shut the womb of Hannah until her spirit shifted from bitterness to surrender. Because the promise was too holy to be birthed through performance. It had to come through brokenness. How many of us are still trying to perform our way into breakthrough? Trying to impress our way into a calling? Trying to prove to people we're anointed when God already approved us in secret? The real construction happens when no one is watching. That's when the foundation of trust is poured. That's when the lies we believed about ourselves are confronted. That's when the trauma that shaped our personalities is healed. God doesn't need you to be impressive. He needs you to be real. Because the calling on your life isn't about influence, it's about impact. And real impact is born in rooms where no one claps. Let's talk about Jesus again. He spent 30 years hidden for 3 years of ministry. Let that sink in. God in the flesh, walking among men, unrecognized, not preaching, not performing miracles, just obeying in silence, building tables with His hands, loving people who didn't know who He was, honoring parents who didn't fully understand Him, waiting, listening, surrendering. Because when the time finally came, He didn't just walk in power, He walked in understanding. That's why He could kneel before Judas and wash his feet. That's why He could sit at a table with people who would abandon Him. He had already died to His need to be accepted. He had already laid down the desire to be understood. He had already let go of the craving to be defended. What kind of person does that? A person who was constructed by silence. And if you've been in a season where everything is stripped, where your dreams feel distant and your heart feels heavy, maybe it's because God is rebuilding you from the ground up. Not with flashy bricks of success, but with the quiet strength of trust, with the unshakable steel of endurance, with the sacred glue of humility. Because the unstoppable ones don't rise by accident. They're carved, sanded, refined, and every scar becomes a signature of God's hand. You're not behind. You're not forgotten. You're being drafted into a different kind of army, the kind that doesn't march for recognition, but fights for truth. The kind that doesn't fear the fire because they were forged in it. The kind that doesn't run from silence because they know that's where the orders are given. Somewhere along the way, you stopped asking for the crowd. You stopped begging to be seen. You stopped trying to force open doors God wasn't ready to unlock. And without even realizing it, you became different, quieter, sharper, more dangerous to hell than you ever were when you had everything going for you. Because silence didn't break you. It built you. It emptied you of pride. It crushed your idols. It rewired your identity. You no longer measure God's presence by how much you're producing. You no longer define success by how many people applaud. Because you've learned what few believers ever discover, that growth without noise is more powerful than hype without depth. That being hidden by God is not punishment, it's strategy. You didn't waste that season. You didn't die in the wilderness. You let the wilderness do what it was designed to do. Turn you into someone that Pharaoh fears, but God can trust. And now, there's a sound in the spirit that only those who've been through silence can recognize. It's the sound of something breaking open. Not in a room, not in a church, in you. Isaiah 43:19 says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." And for a long time, you thought the wilderness meant delay. You assumed the desert meant denial. But what if it was all a setup? What if the very silence that felt like a prison was actually the proof that something sacred was under construction? When God declares a new thing, it never starts big. It starts deep. It starts in places no one can see, beneath the scars, beneath the disappointments, beneath the memories you never speak of. It starts in the old wounds you thought were healed, in the private prayers you whispered through tears, in the hidden sacrifices you made when no one said thank you. That's where the new thing begins, in the trenches, in the ashes, in the silence. But now, the season is shifting, and not because you fought your way out, but because you surrendered, the kind of surrender that doesn't come from weakness, but from wisdom, because only someone who's been truly broken can carry what's truly holy. Only someone who has walked through silence can speak with the kind of authority that doesn't need a microphone to echo in the spirit. You are not the same person who entered that cave. Your silence was not passive. It was warfare. It was obedience, when quitting would have made more sense. It was trusting God while your mind screamed doubt. And because you didn't run from the silence turned you into someone hell no longer recognizes. That's why you feel different now. You're not chasing anymore. You're not explaining yourself to people who don't see you. You're not watering down your calling to be liked. You know what it's like to walk through fire and come out carrying glory. You know what it's like to be refined in silence until the only voice that matters is God's. So when the river starts flowing through the desert, you don't panic. You don't try to control it. You don't ask why it took so long. You recognize the timing. You recognize the texture of God's movement because you've been still long enough to discern the difference between the noise of man and the breath of God. Now you know how to move without rushing, how to obey without needing to understand, how to speak with power without shouting. And maybe that's the real miracle of this entire season, that you finally stopped measuring your worth by what you could build and started measuring it by what you survived. Some will look at you and see the same face, but they won't know what's different until you open your mouth, because your silence didn't just change your heart, it changed your voice. It birthed a language of fire, one that only those marked by hidden seasons can speak, one that calls out demons without fear, one that speaks to dry bones and watches them rise, one that doesn't entertain shallow religion because it has tasted holy refinement. The days ahead won't be easy, but they'll be different, because now you're not walking as a beggar for favor. You're walking as a carrier of presence. You're not asking to be used. You're overflowing. You're not fighting to be seen. You're glowing in the places that used to feel like tombs. And the enemy? He no longer sees a silent believer. He sees a threat, a survivor, a weapon. This is where the new thing begins. Not in your comfort zone, not in your schedule, but in your spirit, where something ancient and eternal begins to move through you. Not because you earned it, but because you endured. You are not the same. And the silence was never empty. It was holy.